So I think there was an ideological component to India's economic liberalization that started in 1991. I think the old economic policies were motivated by a different ideology that changed in the course of the 80s. And what shaped the new policies was a different ideological vision, a more liberal ideological vision. The old ideology was what is often called the Nehruvian consensus. So the Nehruvian consensus was that unlike in China and Russia, we want to avoid a conflict between the property holders and without property. And the uh, the Indian leaders were very much in favor of redistribution, but they wanted to avoid the class conflict that had led to violent revolutions in Russia and China. And so what they did was they said, okay, we are not going to expropriate the property of the property class after independence, but instead we are going to implement such economic policies that the fruits of any future economic growth, okay, would largely go to the poor people. Okay, so property people, you can keep your property, okay, but future growth is going to be for the benefit of the poor. And that was the Nehruvian consensus. Now, implementing that Nehruvian consensus required sacrifices all around. It required the freedom of the property holders and the business people to be highly circumscribed, okay, because of the interventionist state. There were high taxes, there was the license Raj, there were import controls. Also, people's consumption had to be curtailed in order to generate the resources for investment to push for the state-led industrialization. And it is difficult to extract resources from people for that was required for planning under a democratic setup. And in order to justify their actions, in order to justify their interventionist economic policies, the Indian leaders relied on certain ideological beliefs that were already very prevalent in the Indian society. So one of those beliefs was a strong suspicion of businessmen in India. And that is also related to the caste structure. So in the Indian caste structure, the Hindu caste structure, the businessmen don't rank very high. They are the third caste in the hierarchy of castes. And so those who come from the top two castes, the Brahmins, the scholars, the caste from which most of the national leaders were drawn from, look down upon businessmen. So traditionally, business activity has not been accorded a very high social status in Indian or Hindu society. And the Indian leaders were able to draw upon that low status of businessmen to justify exercising control over them. You don't want to entrust the nation to these business people, do you? Right? It's better to leave economic policy to the hand of the scholars, the disinterested people, which is what the Indian leaders considered themselves to be. The second ideological point that Indian leaders were able to draw on was was this idea that individual desires should be subdued to the needs of the community. And in this case, the community was the nation state rather than, your smaller local community. And so people were told, right, you guys want to consume, you guys want to import, you guys want to do business, but we can't let you do that because the needs of the community, the nation state, the developmental needs of the nation state are paramount. Okay. Now, over the course of the 1980s, those ideological beliefs kind of weakened. And this is what we see in the films. Okay. People were no longer willing to suppress their individual desires, okay, for the benefit of the community as a whole. And businessmen were no longer seen as necessarily antisocial elements. Okay, people were beginning to think that trading, commerce has some redeeming social qualities. And it was because of these two cultural or ideological changes in India that the Indian government was able to move towards more economically liberal policies in the 1990s.